Or maybe Erima, you might want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think that competition is in many ways like the profound driving force of the shifts that we've seen in the university sector. And I think the most important aspect of that is the competition between universities that is driven by the withdrawal of public funding. Like a huge decrease from 90% in the 80s around there to now down to 40% or perhaps even lower of government funding, of university funding comes from the federal government. And that gap is plugged with student fees and private, seeking private donations and partnerships and that sort of thing. And I think what you've seen as part of that is a huge expansion of course places to actually get students in, as well as a huge increase in fees. So that's part of, I think, the effect that it's had, but also a huge shift in what universities are actually willing to use that funding for. So you can see how faculties that are able to attract large numbers of international students get renovations. Those renovations are often paid for by corporate law firms that get their, personal firms. The lecture theatres are named after those firms. You see the money that universities pour into advertising, and students are actually paying ever more money for their degrees, and yet they're losing courses and staff and things that aren't profitable in that drive for competition. I think that's more significant than competition between students, because actually at the moment the federal government is trying to massively increase the number of students that get access to higher education, but obviously there's still competition about which university you're going to get into, which courses you're going to get into, and that sort of thing. But I think it's that very intense competition between universities to get the biggest surpluses and to attract the biggest numbers of postgrads and international students that's shifting the priorities of what gets funding at universities.
I think one more point in terms of competition there is that it's not just an inter-university competition, it's also an inter-sector competition now, especially for the international student market. And when I said we represent 500,000 students, almost more than 50% of the student population is in the private sector and the wet sector. And those are getting really competitive now. Their courses are specifically designed to attract international students for specific courses that they seek to leave their countries and to study specific skills and sense. So I think universities now have to be more competitive in the sense that they need to improve their innovations and structures in such a way that they need to compete with these private sectors, which are loaded with investments. So of course the role of state plays an important role there.
Could you pass the microphone to Hannah, please? Because I think you have something that you can relate to this thing.
Do we want to talk about the competition between universities and the way that universities are reconceptualising themselves as an industry that competes internally? That's one problem. And competition as being a defining factor that starts to infuse what we think quality is. So that, I guess that many of the government initiatives in trying to promote competition both between universities but also between academics within universities is this belief that competition produces better quality. And to the point where if you've got a certain pot of money, the government decided sometime in the 1980s that it would be better to take that pot and to allocate it to fewer people more competitively as a signifier, so it becomes like a symbol of quality, right? And so this was to protect themselves, so that the government could say, see, we're dedicated to a quality system, whereas if they were to give a little bit of money to everybody, that would indicate that they were dedicated to mediocrity, and would open themselves to criticism from opposition and that kind of thing. And so that then, I think, started to infuse the culture that we perpetuate on campus and between campuses, and helps and affects us at every level. So part of the reason I think universities are competing with one another is that whole ethic is driving our university leaders to compete between themselves not for any reason. What does it matter what another university is doing? What's the point in that? Except that this is now the ethic that is infusing everything that we're doing. So between staff, that means that we start to internalise that, and I think that this is what we were talking about before, that my quality can be now indicated in the amount of research dollars that I'm getting, and I'll put that on my CV, and I feel like I have to. But the reason I'm doing it is because this ethic has infused everything that we've done to the point that it's shaping, and then it has a real effect, so that will affect then the jobs that I can apply for, or how competitive I am in job applications and in promotions.
I think you wanted to say something, Robert.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in with that. They're all really good comments. Because what we have to be aware of is how perverse the effects of competition can be. Partly because there's no ceiling to it, right? It just keeps going, It's like how fast you can run the 100 metres, right? It's always possible for someone else to do it a bit faster. When you think about it, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for every university in the world to want to be in the top, whatever it is, because they can't, right? There has to be some kind of ranking. So that pursuit of being better than the others at all times has really perverse effects. And one of the perverse effects is that claims that people can make about how good they are, universities, individuals, or whatnot, start to take over what it is they actually do. Right? So that it becomes a struggle between representations, and becomes a hyper-reality where the people or the institutions or the countries that win are the ones that happen to have the best stories to tell, the best narratives. And so the bullshit factor just goes through the roof. That is one of the effects of that kind of competition. If you simply make some money available and say compete with it, then what people do is make up a story as to why they should have the money, irrespective of whether they actually had any good ideas to start with. So that competitive dynamic produces a strange kind of insanity in the way in which university life operates, and it'd be good if we could somehow wind that back, if we could somehow come up with a critique of the whole ranking idea, and come up with a discourse that says that, look, it doesn't actually matter, exactly where we rank. That's not going to be easy to do because it's been built in so deeply into the global structure of higher education. But that should be one of the things that we think about.
I guess my take on it is, in a sense, this move to competition is very interesting on a number of levels. The first thing is, obviously, universities aren't unique to this. The new public management agenda of the late 80s, the 1990s said, what we'll do is we'll take these old-fashioned state services and we'll create internal markets, right? And competition will be our substitute for quality, because actually we really suck at determining what quality is. And if we think about the higher education sector, of course it is really difficult, right? Yeah. But of course, one of the difficulties is does that market model work? And one of the things we see, particularly with, say, students, is it is very difficult for students, and now we have to keep in mind, and their parents leaning over them, looking at the computer as they make their choices. It's really difficult for students to understand what one university is like compared to another university. We also know that students make extremely constrained choices when they choose universities. They often like to go where their peers go, where they have social acceptance. And of course, universities respond by not necessarily improving the invisible aspects of what they offer competitively, but what we euphemistically call the student experience. So UNSW, for example, is the market leader, right? The market leader in turning its campus into a shopping mall. And it looks exactly like a shopping mall, because if you cannot access information about what you're going to get on campus, then what can you do? You can just see how great it is, and the services, and there are cafes. There's the White House is now a really great bar, and and we're doing that on this campus as well, because that's where we start to compete. But I think what I'd say is that the university sector is particularly susceptible to the perniciousness of competition, because unlike in other parts of the public sector, academics are particularly egocentric in their orientation. Now, I don't say that because it's a bad thing. It is one of the things that always attracted me to the academy. Partly because... partly because I'm an egocentric person, but also because I like to do my own work. I have pride in the work that I do. I wrote a book. I published this. Teams... Everyone will tell you that they hate working in teams, right? And so universities used to be the last place that you can avoid doing that sort of thing. But of course, because of the egocentrism of the workers, the competition thing became particularly problematic in our sector. Whereas if you look at the creation of internal markets in the public sector more generally, people are less egocentric in their orientation, they're more team oriented, they're already working in teams and stuff like that. And so there was a degree to which the competition fell onto teams. Now, it didn't work as effectively as the neoliberal of the 80s and 90s wanted it to, but it was less pernicious than in this environment. And I can also say that, and I know I'm crunching time, but I'll just say this last thing, that the extension of this competition outside of the higher education sector is appalling. My daughter's applying for a selective school, a public sector school, because she has an interest in that area. She was asked to provide a CV to get into a high school. What the fuck are you putting on that CV? Grade 3, mastered unstructured play. Grade 4, led the development of new peer networks. What this is sort of hilarious, it's also deadly depressing because, my daughter is now the child of, upper middle class, university educated. She can make a better swipe at writing a good CV to get into that than someone further down the social gradient.
Can I comment? I think one of the things that's most dangerous about this kind of competitive thing, though, is that the university's focus is not just on providing a service, it's on knowledge. And so if what the effect of shifting academic culture to a competitive one that's measurable by money means a shift in the location of the value of the university, thinking about the value of the university in monetary terms rather than in terms of the value of knowledge. And so while academics have always been egocentric, and I think that that's got to do with legitimacy as much as it is a personality trait or something. But as in, I think that we've got a very tenuous claim to an authority over knowledge, and we use egos in order to kind of shore up that claim. But so as in, we were competitive before, right? We were already a bit like that. So, but it was a gift culture that wasn't about sharing and loving each other. The gift, as all those people that are very much on Mouse would say, is an act of aggression. And so, but what it did do was it deposited knowledge into the community of scholars in a way that meant that the rewards for that would be returned via some other means, and kept knowledge as being at the centre of the university. It was not perfect. It was a terrible boys' club, and there's all sorts of dreadful things going on. But what it did do was keep knowledge at the centre of the university, and by emphasising the kind of competition that we've got now, instead we imagine the value of the university in monetary terms. I think that's the problem.